Seraphina, the princess of the Galax Empire, stood on the balcony of her palace, gazing out at the bustling city below. The sky was a deep purple, filled with stars, and the air was warm and heavy with the scent of alien flowers that bloomed, only on her home planet. Despite the beauty of her surroundings, Seraphina felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. She had lived in this grand palace her entire life, surrounded by luxury, power, and expectations. Yet, she had never felt more trapped. The Galax Empire was one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, and as the only heir to the throne, Seraphina was expected to make a political alliance through marriage. It was not just a matter of love. It was about securing the future of her people. Suitors came from every corner of the galaxy, alien lords, warriors, and noblemen. All of them wanted to marry her, hoping to gain favor with the mighty Galax Empire. But Seraphina rejected them, all one by one. She had been told that her marriage would unite powerful families and ensure peace across the galaxy. But Seraphina had seen enough of the world to understand that such unions often came at the cost of personal freedom. The thought of marrying someone for political gain without love or respect filled her with a deep sense of dread. "Your Highness," came the voice of her chief advisor, Lord Malian. His tone was formal and respectful, but Seraphina could hear the impatience in his words. "The suitors are arriving tomorrow. It is time to make a decision. Your father, the Emperor, will not tolerate any further delays." Seraphina turned away from the balcony, her eyes meeting the advisor's. He was a tall, thin man, with sharp features and a cold expression. His loyalty to the throne was unquestionable, but Seraphina had always found him hard to trust. "I know, Lord Malian," she replied, her voice steady but filled with a quiet frustration. "But none of them are right for me." Lord Malian raised an eyebrow. "Your Highness, I understand your feelings, but you must think about the future. The Empire needs you to marry a strong and influential leader. A powerful ally will strengthen our position in the galaxy." Seraphina sighed and walked to the large window that overlooked the sprawling city. The lights from the city below twinkled like stars, but to her it all felt distant and empty. The idea of marrying someone just to please her father or the Empire seemed like a betrayal of everything she believed in. She wanted a marriage based on mutual respect, not politics. She glanced at the portraits hanging on the walls of her palace. They were of past rulers, great leaders who had shaped the Galax Empire into what it was today. Each one had made difficult decisions, but their legacies were marked by power, not love. Seraphina wondered if she would ever be able to leave her own mark on history. "Lord Malian," she said quietly, turning back to face him, "I will not marry anyone who does not respect me for who I am, not just for my title." The advisor's expression softened, though only slightly. "Your Highness, I understand your desire for love, but you must also consider the needs of the Empire. You cannot let personal feelings stand in the way of duty." Seraphina's eyes narrowed. She had heard this argument before, and it always sounded the same. Duty over personal happiness, power over peace of mind. The same old story, repeated throughout. "History. I will think about it," she said, though she knew her mind was already made up. She had rejected the last few suitors who had arrived at the palace, and she had no intention of changing her mind now. No amount of political pressure would make her settle for a loveless marriage. The next day, the palace was filled with activity. The suitors were arriving in grand ships, each one more impressive than the last. Seraphina's father, Emperor Tiberius, had arranged a grand banquet in their honor. The palace was decorated with flowers from the finest gardens in the empire, and the air was filled with the sound of music and laughter. But Seraphina couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She sat at the head of the long dining table, her royal attire more magnificent than any of the others in the room. But despite the opulence of the banquet, she felt out of place. The men who had come to seek her hand were all powerful in their own ways, but none of them seemed to understand her. They treated her like a prize to be won, a trophy to be displayed. They didn't see her as a person, just as a symbol of the Galax Empire's strength. As the evening wore on, Serafina grew more restless. She couldn't bear to listen to the sycophantic praise of the men around her, each one trying to outdo the other with promises of wealth, power, and influence. It was all so empty. She longed for something real, something genuine. After the banquet, Serafina excused herself from the gathering, slipping away from the crowded halls of the palace. She made her way to the private gardens, where she could be alone for a while. The garden was a peaceful place, filled with the scent of alien flowers and the soft chirping of exotic creatures. It was the one place in the palace where Serafina could find a sense of calm. She sat on a stone bench beneath a large tree, closing her eyes and listening to the sounds of nature around her. For a few moments, she allowed herself to relax, to forget about the pressures of her royal duties. But even in this moment of peace, she knew the decision was coming. Tomorrow, the suitors would have their chance to impress her, and she would be expected to choose one. But how could she choose any of them? None of them understood her. None of them had the courage to challenge her views or to see her as more than a princess. She needed someone who would treat her as an equal, someone who would challenge her to think differently, someone who didn't care about her title. As Serafina sat there, lost in thought, she didn't notice the figure approaching until he was standing right in front of her. "Your Highness," said a voice that was calm and steady. Serafina looked up, startled. Before her stood a human, a simple engineer by the looks of him. He was dressed in worn clothing, the kind that workers often wore, and his hands were calloused from labor. His eyes were kind but held a quiet strength, the kind that came from someone who had faced hardship but had never given up. Serafina had never seen him before, but something about his presence felt different. There was no fawning or flattery in his words, no attempt to impress her. He was just there. She felt a flicker of curiosity rise within her. "What do you want?" she asked, though her voice was softer than she intended. The man smiled slightly. "I heard that the princess of the Galax Empire likes to spend time in the gardens. I wanted to see if the rumors were true." Serafina raised an eyebrow, surprised by his boldness. "And what would you want with a princess?" He shrugged, his expression unchanging. "Maybe I just wanted to meet someone who isn't like the others. You don't seem interested in all the power and titles. I wanted to see if that was true." Serafina stared at him, uncertain of how to respond. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her so plainly. She had always been treated with reverence or fear, but this man saw her for who she truly was. "Perhaps you've come to see if I'll marry one of the suitors," she said, a touch of bitterness in her voice. "But I can assure you, I will not." He nodded, understanding. "I figured as much. But sometimes, it's nice to be seen for who you really are, not just what people want you to be." Serafina blinked, taken aback. No one had ever put it quite like that. She looked at the man, this simple human who seemed to understand her better than anyone else in the room. "I think you're right," she said quietly. And for the first time in a long while, Serafina felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was someone in the galaxy who could see beyond her title, someone who could understand her struggle. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity in the palace. Serafina's father, Emperor Tiberius, was determined to make his daughter choose a suitor. He believed that it was a matter of empire, not feelings. The suits for marriage were not just personal matters. They were political strategies to maintain the strength of the Galax Empire. But Serafina's heart was not in it. She was tired of the grand gestures and empty words. No suitor had impressed her, and she wasn't sure any of them ever would. The palace was full of men from all corners of the galaxy, noblemen from distant planets, powerful warriors from militaristic systems, and wealthy merchants eager to buy their way into the royal family. They had all come for one purpose: to win the hand of Princess Serafina. But none of them knew her, truly. They saw her as an object to be claimed, an empire to be gained. None of them saw the woman behind the title. In the middle of all this, Jace, the human engineer from the mining colony on Helios, was a stark contrast to the men in the palace. He didn't belong in this grand hall filled with noblemen and military leaders, but something about him drew Serafina's attention. He didn't look at her like a princess. He looked at her like a person, like someone who had a heart, a mind, and a soul, not just a crown. Jace had been working at the mining colony for several years. He wasn't rich or powerful, but he was known for his skill with machinery and his quiet determination. It wasn't often that someone like him crossed paths with someone like Serafina, but fate had a way of making things happen when least expected. It was during one of her secret escapes from the palace, as she wandered the streets of the colony, in disguise, that she saw him again. Jace was walking through the crowded market carrying a toolbox. The human was far from the grand nobles of the galaxy, but there was a kind of strength in his simple walk, a purpose in his every step. He wasn't concerned with the title of princess or the riches around him. To him, she was just another person. "Your Highness," Jace said, nodding politely as he noticed her among the crowd. Serafina, though surprised, returned his nod. "I didn't expect to see you here, Jace," she said, lowering her voice slightly so no one else could overhear. He smiled at her, a gentle, easy smile that seemed to brighten his face. "I work here, remember?" His voice was warm, and there was no hint of nervousness, despite her royal status. "Isn't it where you were planning to be, too? Though I doubt the suitors you're rejecting are down here." Serafina laughed lightly. It was the first real laugh she had had in days. It felt strange but freeing. "No, I doubt they would even dream of setting foot in a place like this," she said, looking around at the humble stalls and the hard-working people. Jace tilted his head, studying her. "So, they're all still chasing after you? I heard there's quite a competition for your hand." The smile slipped from her face for a moment. "Yes, the competition is overwhelming," she said, her voice flat. "But none of them understand me. None of them see me for who I truly am." "Then what do you want?" Jace asked, his tone sincere. "If not all those men with their wealth and power?" Serafina's gaze softened as she met his eyes. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to speak her truth. "I want someone who will look beyond my title, beyond my position, someone who will challenge me, who will see me as an equal, not just a symbol of the Empire." Jace nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense," he said simply. He didn't offer advice or try to solve her problem, but his words had an honesty that resonated with her. Their conversation continued for a while, as they wandered through the market, speaking freely, as though the weight of her royal title had vanished. She learned that Jace had been born in a small human colony, far from the grandeur of the Galax Empire. He wasn't wealthy, and he didn't care for political games. He worked because he loved the work. He had no interest in the struggles of empires, only in fixing things that needed fixing. And right now, he seemed to see something in her that none of the suitors had ever noticed. The real Serafina, not the princess. As the sun set, painting the sky with brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jace walked her back to the gates of the palace. They had talked for hours, and Serafina had never felt so at ease with someone in all her life. "I should go," Serafina said reluctantly, glancing toward the gates. "Thank you for today, Jace. She paused, uncertain of what to say. "It was nice to be normal for once." Jace grinned. "You're always normal to me, Your Highness, no need to hide." Serafina smiled, though it was a bittersweet smile. "I suppose you're right." Thank you, Jace. Maybe we can talk again? I'd like that, he said, his voice sincere. With that, they parted ways, but Serafina couldn't help but think about their conversation. She had never spoken to anyone the way she had spoken to him. There was a simplicity to his words, a clarity that made everything feel less complicated. For the first time in a long time, Serafina felt heard. Not as a princess, but as a person. The next few days were filled with tension. The palace was buzzing with preparations for the final banquet, where the suitors would compete for her favor. Her father's expectations were high and the pressure was mounting. But despite everything, Serafina couldn't stop thinking about Jace. His kindness, his honesty, it was so different from the men she had met in the palace. And yet she didn't even know him that well. He was a human, a lowly worker from a mining colony. What would the Empire think if she chose him? The day of the banquet arrived, and Serafina stood in front of her mirror, dressed in the finest gown the palace could provide. Her golden hair was styled elegantly, and the gown shimmered with the light of 1,000 stars. But as she looked at her reflection, she felt none of the joy or excitement that should have come with such an occasion. It was all an act, a performance. The men would dance and flatter her, and at the end of the evening, she would have to choose. One of the men who saw her only as a pawn in their game. But then she thought of Jace. She had already made up her mind. She would not marry for politics. She would not settle for someone who didn't truly see her. The thought of being forced into a marriage for the good of the Empire was something she could no longer accept. That evening, the grand hall was filled with noblemen, their voices rising in a cacophony of polite laughter and words. But Serafina, standing at the center of the room, felt nothing but dread. As she greeted her suitors, she couldn't help but compare them to Jace. Their words were empty, their gestures too rehearsed. They did not speak from the heart. They spoke because they were expected to. And then, as the evening went on, Serafina felt a spark of something she hadn't felt before. Jace had made her realize that she deserved more than this. She deserved someone who valued her for who she was, not for her title. She needed someone who would challenge her, support her, and walk beside her, not behind her. As the banquet continued, Serafina's gaze wandered across the room, but it wasn't to her suitors she looked. Her thoughts were with a human engineer, a simple man who had shown her the truth. Her heart had a voice, and it wasn't going to be silenced any longer. The days that followed the banquet felt like a blur. The palace was still full of suitors, each one trying to impress Serafina with their wealth, power, or charm. But despite the many grand gestures and offers of alliances, Serafina couldn't shake the thought of Jace, the simple human who had seen her for who she truly was, someone who wasn't just a princess to be won, but a woman with hopes, fears, and dreams. After the grand banquet, Serafina had retreated to her private chambers, unable to stomach the constant fawning of the men who came to her with only one purpose: to win her hand. They didn't care about her thoughts, her feelings, or her desires. They cared only about what her marriage could bring them. The thought of spending her life with any of them felt suffocating. The palace, with its golden walls and endless corridors, felt more like a prison than a place of power. Serafina had spent so many years living in luxury, but it no longer mattered. All the riches in the galaxy couldn't fill the emptiness she felt inside. What good was a crown if it came at the cost of personal happiness? One evening, as she walked through the palace gardens, she found herself alone again. The stars above twinkled in the night sky, and the air was warm, filled with the scent of flowers from the alien plants that surrounded her. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe freely without the weight of expectations hanging over her. As she wandered the pathways, her thoughts drifted to Jace. She had seen him only once since their meeting in the market, But his words had stayed with her. He had spoken to her as an equal, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. He hadn't treated her as a princess, but as a person. Serafina knew that she couldn't ignore her growing feelings for him. But what could a human possibly offer her? What would the Empire say if they found out that their princess had developed a connection with someone so far beneath her in status? The thought of the scandal was enough to make her hesitate. She had been raised to marry for the good of her people, to secure powerful alliances that would strengthen the Empire. But the idea of marrying someone who didn't truly know her, it felt wrong. Her father, Emperor Tiberius, had made it clear that his goal was to see the Empire's power grow, and Serafina's marriage was a key part of that vision. But it wasn't just about alliances and power. It was about finding someone who understood her, someone who could see past the title and the crown. And yet, no one in the palace seemed to see her that way. The suitors, with their grand words and even grander promises, were all the same. They only wanted to marry the princess, not the woman. They wanted to win her favor, not her heart. It was during one of her walks in the garden, as she sat on a stone bench, that she saw him again. Jace. He had somehow found his way into the royal gardens, though Serafina had no idea how. He stood near the entrance, looking out at the flowers, his hands resting in his pockets. He seemed unaware of how out of place he looked among the elegance of the palace grounds, but that only made him more intriguing. Serafina stood up, a little surprised, to see him. "Jace?" she called out softly, unsure if he would even hear her. He turned and smiled when he saw her. "Princess," he said, his voice as calm and familiar as it had been the first time they met. "I hope I'm not intruding. I just needed a break from all the machinery." Serafina smiled in return, though it was a small one. "You're not intruding. I come here to escape too." Jace nodded, walking toward her slowly. "Good to know. It's nice to see someone actually relax in a place like this." Serafina laughed, though it was quiet. "Yes, well, sometimes the weight of all this luxury is heavier than it looks." She gestured to the vast gardens, the golden statues, and the towering palace in the distance. "I can't remember the last time I felt free." Jace looked at her, with understanding in his eyes. "I can imagine. Must be hard to live under a crown and all the pressure that comes with it." Serafina nodded. "You have no idea. Every day there are people telling me what to do, what to think, who to marry. They all have their own ideas about my life, but none of them understand me." Jace paused, his gaze softening. "I think I understand more than you think," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I'm not a prince, and I don't know what it's like to live with a crown, but I know what it's like to feel trapped. I know what it's like to want to do something for yourself, but to be surrounded by people who want to control your every move." Serafina looked at him, surprised by his words. He wasn't just talking about politics or power. He was talking about something deeper, something more personal. "I know you've been told what to do your whole life," Jace continued, "but it's okay to want something different. You don't have to let everyone else decide your future for you." Serafina felt a knot in her chest loosen. It was as if his words had unlocked something inside her that she had been holding back for so long. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear those words until now. "But what about the Empire?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about my father? He's been preparing me to rule for my whole life. How can I just walk away from all of that?" Jace gave her a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to walk away from it. You just need to find your own path. You're the one who will lead your people one day, not anyone else, not your father. You have to make your own decisions, even if they're hard, especially if they're hard." Serafina stared at him for a long moment. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight she hadn't expected. He wasn't telling her what to do or offering her any easy solutions. He was simply giving her the space to think for herself, to consider what she truly wanted. "You make it sound so simple," Serafina said, a faint smile on her lips. Jace chuckled softly. "It's not simple at all, but sometimes it's the simple things that make the most sense." They stood in silence for a while, the only sound being the soft rustle of the leaves in the breeze. Serafina felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a feeling of connection, of being seen for who she truly was, not just as a princess, but as a person. "I never thought I'd be talking like this to someone like you," Serafina said after a while, her voice light. "Someone who's not afraid to tell me the truth." Jace smiled, his eyes kind. "I think that's what you need. Someone who isn't afraid to speak the truth, no matter what." Serafina nodded slowly, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for his honesty, his kindness, and his willingness to treat her as an equal. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. "I'm glad we met, Jace," she said, her voice soft. "Me too," he replied. They stood there, both silent, as the stars above them began to shine brighter in the night sky. For Serafina, it felt like the beginning of something new, something she hadn't dared to hope for. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to live for herself, without the weight of the crown always holding her down. The days that followed Serafina's conversation with Jace felt heavier than ever. The weight of her responsibilities as the princess of the Galax Empire pressed down on her with each passing hour. Her father, Emperor Tiberius, had made it clear that the time had come to choose a suitor. The great banquet was approaching, the final opportunity for the suitors to present themselves and prove their worth. Her marriage would determine the future of the empire, and Serafina knew that the pressure to make the right choice was enormous. She spent most of her days in her private chambers, lost in thought. Her father, her advisors, and the suitors themselves all had their own expectations, but none of them seemed to understand her or even care about what she truly wanted. She had been raised to believe that duty to the empire was the most important thing. Everything else was secondary. Yet now, the idea of marrying for political gain felt suffocating. She wanted more than that. She wanted to be seen as more than a royal figure, more than just a tool for political power. As the days ticked down to the banquet, Serafina's thoughts constantly returned to Jace. Their conversations in the garden had made her feel something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace. Jace had shown her that it was possible to find someone who didn't care about her title or her royal duties, someone who valued her as a person. But she was torn. How could she, the future ruler of the Galax Empire, even consider a relationship with someone like him? He was human, a simple engineer from a mining colony. He had no power, no wealth, and no connections to offer her. Yet, there was a part of her that couldn't ignore the connection she felt with him. She found herself questioning everything she had been taught. Was it possible to choose love over duty? Was it possible to rule the empire without sacrificing her own happiness? The night before the grand banquet, Serafina stood before a large mirror in her chambers, staring at her reflection. She wore the finest gown she had ever seen, its deep blue fabric shimmering in the light. Her golden hair was styled elegantly, and the crown that rested on her head seemed heavier than ever. As she gazed at her reflection, she felt a sense of emptiness deep inside. The woman she saw in the mirror was beautiful, powerful, and poised, but she didn't recognize herself anymore. The woman in the mirror was a princess, bound by duty, responsibility, and expectations. But what about the woman beneath the crown? What about Serafina, the person who longed for freedom, for love, for a life beyond the palace walls? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. Tomorrow would be the day she had to make a choice. Her father would expect her to choose one of the powerful suitors who had come to win her favor. But could she go through with it? Could she marry someone she didn't love just to fulfill her duty? The sound of soft knocking at the door interrupted her thoughts. Serafina turned to face the door, surprised to see Lord Malleon, her father's chief advisor, standing in the doorway. "Your Highness," Lord Malleon said with a bow, his voice as formal as always. "The banquet will begin shortly. I trust you are ready?" Serafina nodded slowly, though she didn't feel ready. "Yes, Lord Malleon. I'll be down shortly." Lord Malleon didn't leave immediately. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking again. "I must remind you, Your Highness, that this is a crucial event. The future of the Empire depends on your choice. Your father's vision for the future relies on your decision." Serafina's heart sank. She had heard these words countless times before. Her father's vision, her duty. But what about her own vision? What about her own desires? "I understand," she said quietly, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Lord Malleon." He gave a final bow and left the room, leaving Serafina alone with her thoughts once again. The pressure was unbearable. She knew that no matter who she chose, there would be consequences. If she chose one of the powerful suitors, she would be securing the future of the Empire. But if she rejected them, she risked angering her father and the Empire's allies. Serafina took one last look at herself in the mirror before leaving her chambers. She couldn't avoid the banquet forever. She had a duty to her people, and she couldn't let her personal desires cloud her judgment. But as she made her way through the palace halls, her thoughts kept returning to Jace. He wasn't part of this world. He wasn't part of the power games and politics that defined her life. But that was what made him different. That was what made him special. The grand banquet hall was filled with nobles, generals, and diplomats, all dressed in their finest attire. The room glittered with chandeliers, and the air was thick with conversation and the clinking of glasses. Serafina stepped into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like a stranger in her own home, surrounded by people who didn't truly know her. She was expected to smile, to be gracious, to play the part of the perfect princess. But all she wanted was to escape. Her father, Emperor Tiberius, was already at the head of the room, greeting the guests with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He noticed Serafina as soon as she entered, and his gaze softened. "There, you are my daughter," he said, his voice warm but with a hint of concern. "I trust you are ready to make your choice?" Serafina gave a polite nod, though her insides were twisting with anxiety. "Yes, father. I am ready." The suitors were already gathered around the room, each one trying to impress her with their words and gestures. There was a tall, regal alien lord from the Oridian system whose fleet was feared across the galaxy. There was a charming merchant from the Belisar belt whose wealth was said to rival that of entire star systems. There was even a war hero, a warrior who had earned a reputation for his victories in battle. They were all powerful, influential, and successful. But none of them understood her. Serafina couldn't help but compare them to Jace. He didn't have wealth, power, or armies, but he had something the others lacked: honesty. He treated her like a person, not a prize to be won. The evening wore on, and the pressure to make a decision grew with every passing moment. Serafina's mind raced. She knew that she had to choose someone by the end of the night. But every time she looked at one of the suitors, she couldn't help but feel that something was missing. None of them made her feel the way Jace had. None of them made her feel understood, seen, and respected. As the evening came to a close, Emperor Tiberius stood and raised his glass, signaling for everyone to quiet down. "My daughter has made her decision," he announced, his voice carrying across the room. "The future of the Galax Empire rests on this moment. Princess Serafina, You may now choose your suitor." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Serafina. Her heart raced in her chest. She could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, the pressure to make the right choice. The future of the empire was in her hands. Serafina took a deep breath and turned to face her father. She had made up her mind. She knew what she had to do. "I choose no one," she said, her voice clear and firm. The room gasped in shock. The suitors looked at each other in confusion, while her father's face darkened with anger. "I choose no one," Serafina repeated, her voice unwavering. "I will not marry for power. I will not marry for political gain. I choose to rule the empire on my own terms." The silence in the room was deafening. Serafina stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, but for the first time in her life she felt free. The silence in the grand banquet hall felt suffocating. The words Serafina had just spoken echoed in her mind, even as they hung in the air, challenging everything the empire stood for. "I choose no one," she had said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. The shock in the room was almost tangible. Her father, Emperor Tiberius, stood at the head of the room, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. The suitors, men from every corner of the galaxy, each one powerful and influential, gazed at her in stunned silence. This was not the way things were supposed to go. The princess was meant to choose one of them, secure the future of the galaxy, empire through marriage, and seal the alliance that would ensure peace for generations. But Serafina had just shattered that expectation. Her father's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Serafina felt like a small child again, standing before him, trembling under his gaze. But she held her ground. This was not a decision she could undo. She had already made her choice. "I do not understand." Her father's voice cut through the silence. "You stand before me, the heir to the Galax's throne, and you refuse to choose a suitor? This is not just about you, Serafina. It is about the Empire, the future of our people." Serafina's throat tightened, but she did not look away. She had heard these words all her life, but today, they didn't have the same power over her. "I understand, Father. But my duty to the Empire does not mean I must sacrifice my happiness. I will not marry for power, nor for political gain. I will marry for love, or not at all." The room erupted into whispers. The suitors exchanged glances, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. The very idea of rejecting an opportunity to marry into royalty was unheard of. But Serafina had done it. She had refused to follow the rules of the galaxy, choosing instead to follow her heart. Her father's face grew darker. His voice, though calm, was laced with frustration. "You are the future of the Empire, Serafina. You cannot afford to let emotions cloud your judgment. You cannot let love dictate your choices." "I am the future of the Empire, Father," Serafina replied, her voice firm. "But I am also a person. I deserve to choose my own future, to find my own path. The Empire will not fall if I marry someone who respects me as an equal, who values me as a person, not just a piece of a political puzzle." Her father was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, perhaps looking for support among the suitors or advisors. But none of them spoke. There was no one who could challenge Serafina's decision. Not in that moment. Not in her heart. "I will not force you into a marriage, Serafina," Emperor Tiberius said finally, his voice colder now. "But understand this. You risk everything for a dream that may never come true. If you choose to follow your heart, you do so at your own peril." Serafina's heart clenched, but she refused to back down. "I understand the risks, Father. But I believe that true strength comes from within. If I marry, I will do so because I trust the person, because I choose them for who they are, not for what they can offer the Empire." The room was still, the tension thick. For a moment, Serafina thought her father might argue further, but then he turned away from her, his eyes cold with disappointment. "Then so be it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But remember, the Empire will not wait for you. You are the one who must lead them, not the other way around." Serafina's heart sank at his words, but she knew she had made the right choice. She had taken a step toward freedom, toward being true to herself. As her father turned away and began speaking to the other guests, Serafina felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over her. The weight of the decision was heavy, and she could feel the eyes of the suitors still on her, full of judgment and confusion. But amidst the chaos, she caught sight of someone, a figure standing by the door, quietly observing the scene. Jace. Her heart skipped a beat. There he was, standing at the back of the room, away from the crowds, looking out of place but completely at ease. He wasn't part of this world, the world of power, politics, and endless expectations. But in that moment, Serafina realized that was exactly why she felt so drawn to him. Jace had never tried to win her favor. He had never asked for anything from her. He had simply seen her for who she truly was. Her gaze locked with his, and she saw the warmth in his eyes, the understanding. Without thinking, she made her way across the room, leaving the crowd behind. The moment her feet touched the floor of the grand hall, everything else seemed to fade away. When she reached Jace, he offered her a small, reassuring smile. "I knew you'd make the right choice," he said softly, his voice steady. Serafina stopped in front of him, her breath shallow. "Do you really think so?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jace nodded, his expression filled with sincerity. "I do. It's not easy, but it's the right thing to do. You shouldn't have to choose between your heart and your duty. You can have both." Serafina let out a long breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle into her chest. She had chosen not to marry for politics, but to follow her heart. But was that enough? Could she truly balance her love for Jace with her responsibility as the future ruler of the Galax Empire? "You don't understand, Jace," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "The Empire expects me to be perfect, to marry a powerful ruler, to secure alliances. I don't have the luxury of choosing what makes me happy." Jace's face softened with understanding. "I know. But you also don't have to carry that burden alone. You can rule with someone by your side who sees you for who you really are, not just for what you represent. Someone who will stand with you, not behind you." Serafina's eyes searched his face, and for the first time she saw the possibility of a future she had longed for. A future where she could be both a ruler and a woman, a person with dreams and desires, not just a figurehead. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can balance everything." Jace stepped closer, his presence a comforting weight. "You don't have to do it alone. You have the strength to make your own path, Serafina. And I'll be right here beside you if you'll let me." Serafina looked up at him, the words he spoke giving her the courage she had been missing. She had spent so many years believing that her duty to the Empire came before everything else. But now, she was beginning to understand that her happiness, her peace of mind, was just as important. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Serafina said, her voice steady, her heart full. "I want to rule the Empire, but I also want to live a life of my own choosing. And I want you to be a part of that life, Jace." Jace smiled, his eyes warm with affection. "Then let's do this together." Serafina's heart swelled with hope, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in so long. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it no matter the consequences. The Galax Empire was vast, but it was not as important as the person she was becoming. She could rule with her heart, not just her crown, and with Jace by her side, she believed that she could create a future that was truly her own. As the night wore on, Serafina turned away from the crowd, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. The weight of the crown felt a little lighter now. She wasn't just a princess. She was Serafina, and she was ready to shape her destiny.